Next up, we have a really dynamic panel of leading advocates for expanding postal service and the financial services space and pushing for real postal banking in this country. Postal banking is a critically important way to solve for banking deserts and serve the millions of unbanked and underbanked people in this country, as well as creating a much needed new stream of fiscal revenue service for the Postal Service. I'd like to first introduce our panelists before passing the floor to them. First up is Raúl Carrillo. Raúl is the Deputy Director of the Law and Political Economy Project and an Associate Research Scholar at Yale Law School. He's a leading academic activist in the financial reform community and a leading voice in calling for postal banking. Next is Rakim Brooks. Rakim is a senior campaign strategist at the ACLU, where he focuses on economic and racial justice. He is presently managing the Systemic Equality Campaign, a racial justice agenda that seeks to address America's legacy of racism and systemic discrimination through administrative and legislative campaigns. The pillars of the campaign are success, access, empowerment, prosperity, and reconciliation. Finally, we have Porter McConnell, the campaign director at Take on Wall Street, one of the country's scrappiest fighters for financial reform, where they promote postal banking. Take on Wall Street has also led the Save the Post Office Coalition, which has been incredibly active in defending the Postal Service in the last year. Really excited to have our guests. Raúl, you're up first. Take it away.
You got it. Thank you very much, Chastity. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you very much for the invitation from APWU. Also especially excited to be here with representatives of the Take on Wall Street Coalition and Americans for Financial Reform, where I was previously a fellow, and especially excited to be here with the ACLU as well. I will talk a little bit about privacy and civil liberties, so this is a really good mix we got going here. As Chastity mentioned, I am a legal scholar, but I do want to apologize for not being a specific legal scholar. That's Professor Marisa Baradaram, and although she could not be here today, she really blew up this space in the academic world back in 2014 with an article called "It's Time for Postal Banking" in the Harvard Law Review. Since then, a lot of organizers and activists, as discussed, have really pushed for postal banking or postal financial services. And we have many journalists, I think, to thank for that, some of whom are on the call right now. David Day and The Prospect comes to mind. But I also want to thank postal workers, the unions, and people actually doing the thing for keeping this idea alive. And I don't just mean that in the sense of a policy proposal, but by demonstrating through their excellence every day that they can do something like postal financial services. I live in Jersey City in the Heights, where my fiance's folks are from. It's a predominantly Latino working class neighborhood. And I was at the post office yesterday morning, where the worker in the front was explaining to not one, but probably 5 different people how the direct express cards worked, how the process goes, what they should do if they haven't received their payments, etc. And this is to suggest that in many ways, as we'll discuss, the post office is already engaged in helping people with money, because money and communications are pretty tightly linked. And I think there's a lot to work on here together. So I've been asked to provide sort of an architecture or a vision of different potential ways that postal banking can work. Before I do that, though, I do want to loop things back to the previous presentation and talk about really what I think is the fundamental public nature of banking and postal services. Mr. Cohen was discussing the way in which the post office has been privatized. And the previous speaker was discussing the way in which various services have different public and private components in different countries. We can say the same thing about financial systems themselves. In fact, throughout the United States, we have seen what I would argue is a very heavy emphasis on the private provision of finance versus the public provision of finance. And this is not necessarily the same case in other countries. For instance, in Japan, there's a fully existing postal savings system. In Germany and Brazil, there are various public banking options that serve as part of the machinery there. And it is really in the United States, in part because of our legacy of structural racism and other factors, that we don't have a very strong public component of the system. Although, as many legal scholars, including Professor Baradaran, Professor Bazan at Harvard, Lev Menand at Columbia, Professor Omerover at Cornell, many others have highlighted the public nature of banking and financial services has always been present behind the curtain, so to speak. And we really see that, especially when we look at payments and what's been happening during the pandemic. When this country was founded in the colonies, there were a handful of banks. And then for the next 100 years, there were huge fights between various white men and the government as to how the banking system should look. There were huge Supreme Court cases about what was a permissible banking activity, about how the government should be involved in various ways. And folks have variously started to characterize our existing financial system as something that has been privatized in the first place. The delegation of money and banking services to private banks was done by the federal government explicitly. And in many ways, a lot of the recent visionary policymaking is about revisiting this public-private mix. So postal banking is happening, I think, at a very exciting time in financial reform generally. So Chastity discussed the prevalence of banking deserts. And I think financial services is and access to credit is a particularly important thing to consider. But when we talk about what the postal banking system could provide to folks, it goes far beyond potentially credit and into a number of different possible redesigns, right? And because of the infrastructure and again, the excellent work of postal workers, I think we can foresee a lot of different things happening. Right now, there is pilot legislation for postal banking, building on some of its existing functions. For instance, Postal Service already offers money orders, international money transfers to some other countries, 9 of them, I believe, through something called the Dinero Seguro program in Latin America, thus helping people sending money back home. It can help with check cashing in some instances, and throughout history, it's served various different functions in terms of coin and cash circulation. Right now, it's also involved in the provision of those direct express cards I was talking about previously, helping provide Social Security benefits, and a various number of other things that are, again, financial in nature. And this is not to say that we don't need legislation to move beyond that, which we do, but the foot is sort of already in the door here. And a full-fledged banking system along one end of the spectrum is another thing, but we can foresee a lot of different steps that the post office could take to make financial services more equitable for folks in the United States, as well as to strengthen and bolster the post office. Legislation has recently been proposed by a host of folks. During the CARES Act debate, we saw Congresswoman Waters suggest that postal banking should be integral to the provision of economic relief payments. And that proposal was very much based on a vision by Morgan Ricks at Vanderbilt, Lev Menand at Columbia, who was mentioned previously, and John Crawford at Stanford, whereby the Federal Reserve would offer bank accounts to everyone in the United States who is eligible to receive it, including, in some cases, small businesses. And how they cast this is really, again, a sort of expansion of existing public authority, rather than a wholesale reintegration or recasting of everything. A previous questioner asked, how to start this conversation with folks who really believe in free market ideology. And Menand, Ricks, these other folks point out that the Federal Reserve, the central bank, stands behind the entire banking system as it exists right now. It offers accounts to all financial institutions of a certain caliber, to make the banking system work. And although we can have a debate about how private or public the Federal Reserve is, it is a creature of Congress. It is created by statute. The regulations and conventions that govern how it works and how it interacts with us and the Treasury flow from public law. This is all really up for debate and up for revisitation within a legislative push. And there is an opportunity, as Rick's and other folks highlight, to use the postal banking infrastructure integrated with the Federal Reserve system to offer basic banking services to all folks. And those can include better consumer protections, et cetera. There is another bill by Congressman Sanders, also championed by Congressmember Ocasio-Cortez, to provide more fuller public banking services via the post office directly. And then there are some discussions about involving the Treasury, which historically used to take a far more active role, again, in public financial services generally. It's responsible for helping deliver cash and coin, for instance. The Mint is still located there, and there is a lot of good legal work being done about how to bring the Treasury further into the system and integrate its functions with the postal system in a way it was perhaps originally intended to. And we can discuss again various options later, but there are multiple routes here to postal banking is the point. And we can provide, again, basic services, money orders, check cashing, deposit accounts, et cetera. And we could foresee a place for small dollar lending, perhaps, as Professor Broadon writes about, as other folks see. But I am excited to be having sort of this conversation now about implementation, whereas just several years ago, we were talking about, is this even possible? But again, I think this is a testament to the great work of everybody here that we've advanced things along so far. With my remaining time, I'll just highlight a couple of concerns or things that I think we need to discuss amongst each other as we move along. And these all sort of fall in the banner within consumer, consumer protection. But the first is privacy. And the fact is that data governance legislation and privacy legislation are not robust in the United States for some of the same reasons that we don't have public financial services, right? And my fear is not even so much that Chase will partner on something like postal banking, but that Amazon will, and that we'll get the tech and vendor and distributor services from companies that do not have privacy of folks in mind, which is really important. Because if you look at the latest FDIC survey of household finances, you'll see that privacy is actually one of the top reasons why people don't have bank accounts in the first place. And that's not necessarily because they have something to hide, as the folks at the ACLU will tell you, right? Privacy is important as a civil rights issue. It's important as a structural issue, as an equity issue within our broader economy. And the fact is that most data that goes to the federal government now sloshes around with law enforcement. And so that means if you use an app for the Postal Service on your phone, it will also likely, and you have a private party in there, it can collect all sorts of other information about you without Fourth Amendment protections, because there is another party in the room that is not the federal government. And so there's a lot to consider around privacy and tech. Most saliently, I think, in the need to offer people what we might call wallets as well as bank accounts. Personally, I use Bank of America for some things. I'm also part of the wonderful Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union in New York City, but that sort of institution is not present everywhere in the country, right? And it offers me better privacy protections, but we want to replicate something that is a little bit more equitable and fair. It does exist, and perhaps even build better protections. And so, again, having a wallet where the bank can't see inside your wallet, and then having a bank account maintains the privacy status quo. I think that's really important. There are some projects out there, including the Digital Dollar Project, which is driven by Commissioner John Carlo, who was one of Trump's former CFTC commissioners, that I think get this mix wrong. And we need to be very careful about what happens, especially if the point is to include people who may have had bad interactions with the criminal legal system, people who are undocumented, people who need to protect their identity for reasons of gender equity, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last thing is just that we need to be careful, I think, about how we talk about access to credit and access to financial services as a poverty relief mechanism. Community activists have been saying for years that, again, access to credit or getting a loan is not necessarily how you get out of poverty, right? And Professor Abby Atkinson at Berkeley, I think, has recently articulated that extremely well. And so we need to, I think, be careful about the role of debt and the role of these sort of services in economic justice generally. And that matters, I think, for this conversation, primarily because we are advocating for postal financial services as something to strengthen the USPS. But when you start to say that this is a revenue stream, or that lending is a revenue stream, especially lending to poor folks, then we're talking about the possibility of a dynamic that is dangerous. And so that takes us back upstream to the revisions to existing law that people have talked about. We have to get rid of the pre-funding requirement. We have to stop hamstringing the USPS in a more general way, or postal financial services can become exploitative, not because we want to, but because the USPS will look to that as something, again, to pad the balance sheet. So those are some things that I'm thinking about, but what I've, again, hoped to do is outline the different ways that this can work. And I think we all agree that it should move forward. So I'm excited to have that conversation with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Raúl. Super interesting and exciting information. You've always been a great leader in this space, and so we're really excited to have you on. But we'll jump right into hearing from Rakim. Go ahead, take it away, Rakim.
Thanks very much, Chastity, and thank you, Raúl, for leading us off that way. I thought that was a great presentation. I've just become familiar with your work. I was reading a blog of yours earlier, and it was dense, but it was informative. So I definitely recommend it to everyone. I'm going to try to paint an arc for you all about why we're in this fight, the ACLU, and why you should be in the fight as you are. But let me start off by just acknowledging that we are still in a global pandemic, that while you all are showing up here to support the U.S. Postal Service, you may have experienced loss in your own life, and so I always want to acknowledge that to begin with, particularly because though I don't know who's constituted here, I assume some of you are postal workers who have been on the front lines of this pandemic, and so I want to extend my gratitude to you for continuing to do the work in spite of everything that's going on in your own lives and the nation as a whole. On that line, the ACLU is a nonpartisan organization, but let me say something that should be obvious to all of us. The post office saved democracy. I'll say it again, the post office saved democracy. There can be no doubt about that. January 6th should have made that clear to us, but in case anyone needs to have it on the record, I will say it for you. And honestly, that was the point from the beginning. Raúl pointed out Professor Mercer Baradaran's work. I have a book with me right here, How the Other Half Banks. If you haven't read it, I recommend it to you. But when I say that was the point from the beginning, for all the things that our founders may have gotten wrong, one of the things they got right was the post office. And there's an interesting passage from her book where she remarks that when Louis de Tocqueville wrote his Democracy in America, one of the things he noted was that the most rural farmer seemed to be as educated as some of the aristocrats in France. And the reason for that was the post office. The post office allowed for the transmission of information, which is essential to a democracy. It is essential to ensure an egalitarian democracy in particular. We all know that there are formal democracies in some places that are not rich and fulfilled, but fundamentally, the post office served that function at that point in time, and I think still serves that function today. I want to take those same people, those farmers, and move them forward a little bit into our narrative, because what you'll find in Professor Baradaran's book is that farmers are some of the first people advocating for postal banking in the country, right? It is the fact that they are educated because of the existence of the post office. They're able to receive newspapers, that they develop their own sense of political enlightenment that frankly did not exist at the same scale across the democratic world. And so they begin to advocate for postal banking in order to draw on Raúl's presentation, in order to fight back against private banks that were otherwise limiting the ability of the farmers to actively participate in society and manage their farms effectively. And so someone asked earlier, what happened to postal banking? Well, eventually the farmers break through and win around 1911, and we have postal banking in the country for about 50 years. Why did it go out of phase? Well, part of it was the optimism around the civil rights movement. Lyndon Johnson, I mean, Mercer's sort of summary of it is much tighter, but the essence is Lyndon Johnson is reforming the government. He's trying to cut, not necessarily cut waste in the way that we talk about it, but formalize and streamline certain processes. And the belief is that people are going to flow into the banking system more naturally than they have previously. She's got another wonderful book called The Color of Wealth, where you can learn about all the exclusions from the banking system for people of color and rural folks and poor folks. But so that's the general belief. And so it's allowed to be phased out. But what do we find immediately in the aftermath of that? The rapid growth of predatory lending, which is where Raúl sort of began to end his presentation. So she has a remark that says something to the effect of, prior to the 1970s, payday lending institutions were virtually non-existent in the United States. Today, we have a $100 billion payday lending industry. Now, no one, to my knowledge, maybe Raúl can inform us about this, and I'd love the site, has done the analysis to say, you know, when postal banking went out, did these other institutions come in? But of course, it's the case that it would have been nearly impossible for them to come in if, in fact, there was postal banking. There would not have been the same profit margins to be earned such that they could begin to exploit people in the ways that they are. And so I want to fast forward now, having provided that history, to talk about the state of affairs as they exist today. Today, roughly 50% of Black Americans are unbanked or underbanked, and roughly 45% of Latinx folks in the country are unbanked or underbanked. The result of that is that they are more likely to rely on these predatory financial institutions that, as I said, probably never would have come into existence in the first place if we had had a public banking option, postal banking or otherwise. And so what does that mean for their lives? Well, it means that on average, a family making $25,000 a year spends $2,500 to $3,000 over the course of a year, paying for various fees and services associated with cashing their checks, with translating their checks into money orders and the like. And of course, you can imagine this is devastating for those families. And it's not only because they don't have access to a bank, but predominantly, I think this is something that a postal banking option could help to solve. I'll say a bit more about this, because those same institutions that are providing check cashing services to the unbanked are also the same institutions that are providing payday lending and providing title services. And so just so you get a sense, the average payday loan is about $325. And when that person is done, when this person who's taken out the loan is done paying off the loan, it is usually the case that they've paid over $500 in interest for a $325 loan. And so there are compounding effects to the absence of public banking options in these communities. I'll sort of take us from 2008 and lay down one more marker and then maybe conclude my remarks. After the financial crisis, roughly 2,000 bank branches in the United States closed. And some of you may say, well, good riddance to the bankers. But the fact is that when those banks left communities, they again allowed for the entry of payday lending and other alternative financial services. Since 2013, another 10,000 plus bank branches have closed. And it's estimated that 20% more will close in the aftermath of COVID as financial consolidation continues in the banking industry and banks become less and less concerned about serving the poor. I'm just looking over in the corner to see what's said. Okay. So that financial consolidation will continue and there will be fewer and fewer bank branches throughout the United States. Now, you're going to hear a story from some folks that will suggest, well, actually, think about how you live your life. Now you just use mobile deposit. and you use online tellers, that there's the fintech industry is going to come in and solve the problem of the unbanked and the underbanked. I don't think that that's true. I don't think that that's an accurate reflection of what is likely to happen. Will unbanked and underbanked people begin to use fintech solutions in order to help with their banking? Of course they will. And ideally, there'll be social entrepreneurs who are interested in their well-being, who will create options that don't currently exist for banking. But of course, in the same way that these sort of predatory alternative financial institutions came into neighborhoods, they will come online and connect with these same consumers in the same ways and continue to basically exploit them, exploit their poverty and make it even more expensive to be poor. And so to the point that Raúl was making overall, and I've seen some conversation about it, so I'll sort of try to lay it out where the ACLU's stance on this is. We believe in postal banking because we believe that we need an alternative to these predatory financial services in low and moderate income communities and in rural communities as well. There's a stat I should have said earlier, but I believe it's 69% of majority Black census tracts lack a bank branch. Of course, there is a post office in every zip code in America. And so, as I said, the reason we're in this is because we're concerned about that particular issue. And we believe that under the 2006 postal, someone will correct me on the act, but this authority already exists within the post office. There was a 2014 and 2015 Office of Inspector General report that suggested that the post office today can begin to provide check cashing services, bill pay, expanded check cashing services, bill pay, and expanded money transfers. And we've estimated that over the course of a Black family's lifetime, for example, the presence of these alternatives could save them somewhere in the order of $80,000, which is roughly 2 years of the median Black family's income. And so those services can be provided now. And Porter may talk a little bit about some of the advocacy that we've all been doing in order to try to create a postal service that is hospitable to those alternatives. But to Raúl's point, there are other legislative options that are much more expansive that would create a robust public option similar to what the postal banking system used to be in the United States before. There are all sorts of political hurdles that we will encounter and have to overcome in order to see that become a reality. But as I said before, and at the beginning of my presentation, the post office saved democracy, and I believe that we can get this done. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rakim. Finally, we'll hear from Porter McConnell from Take on Wall Street. Porter, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chastity, and thanks, Rakim, and thanks, Raúl. It's a delight to follow you both. I feel like the job is done. First of all, can you guys see the slide okay? All right, cool. I find some visual learners like to have a visual, so I'm gonna inject that because I know it's late afternoon. But thanks everybody. It was great being with you yesterday. Lots of really good questions and interest in the chat, which is great to see. I'll have a healthy chat. My job is to talk about how we get this done. With the acknowledgement that how we get this done is the folks on this call. So a little humility there, but there's a lot of good work being done, and I'm in the position along with my colleague Stephanie Apollon to coordinate all that great work. So I'll tell you a little bit about where we've been and where we're going. Okay, so why is somebody from a thing called Take on Wall Street involved in this? Just to say that we at Take on Wall Street have been fighting for postal banking pretty much from the beginning. And in our platform, it falls in the fair banking for all leg of the stool. But basically, if we want, especially in the last 40 years, and one could argue since the founding of our country, Wall Street has increasingly encroached into all the parts of our lives. And so one of the ways we fight back is by unrigging the rules, because they have rigged the rules to serve themselves. And so making sure that we have a financial system that serves Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, women, LGBTQIA, differently abled, marginalized peoples, and allows them to share equally in our nation's wealth is going to take a little work. So we need to unrig the rules as they stand. All of the tax loopholes, all of the fines and fees in the criminal justice system, policies that close the racial wealth divide, canceling student debt, all of these ways to kind of restore a little equilibrium in our system. And I'm going to skip over fair banking for all because you're about to hear about that. And then that Wall Street should be serving people. People shouldn't be serving Wall Street. Those of you who've serviced a debt understand this instinctively, but basically the corporate governance model right now, you know, as Don sort of laid out very eloquently, is not really based on the long-term health of the economy and workers and families. It's based on the short-term financial interests of elites. And so we need to undo some of those policies. And we need to do things like close the loopholes that make them so much money. One gentleman who runs a private equity firm gets $100 million from the carried interest loophole alone every year. So we need to unrig some of those things. And then finally, investing, not betting. You guys all, I think, both know the story of the financial crisis and understand that, you know, it was playing with house money, that corporations and large financial institutions, you know, need to be held accountable for the consequences of the risks that they take. So it can't be that we're on the hook for their risky behavior. Personally responsible, ideally. We need to put the firewall back in place between boring deposit banking and risky casino investment banking. Those shouldn't be swimming in the same space. We need to make financial advisors be required to act in their clients' best interests. We need to stop with the selective regulation and deregulation and stop incentivizing corporations to take these risks on our dime by ending too big to fail. So those are the general outlines of what we are up to. When I say fair banking for all, I mean public options for banking. So if you want fair banking for all, I would say that, you know, the great history lessons that we heard from Raúl and Rakim bear out that if, you know, you need to introduce public options into the market. If the private banks wanted to serve these customers and meet these needs, they would already have done it. The options in this system right now seem to be either total exclusion, and I know that Rakim talked a little bit about banking deserts, just, you know, up and leaving communities, or predatory inclusion, which is when you talk about even traditional bank accounts that have crazy high overdraft fees, but also all of the alternative financial services, so payday lenders and title lenders and even check cashers. So we need a public option in this space. We're talking about postal banking today, but I think there was a question in the chat a little bit about a public investment bank. So just to say, like, you know, if anybody asks, I don't know that we're mostly campaigning and mostly trying to get postal banking to happen, but there are a bunch of really exciting policies in this space. And I know Chastity has worked on at least one of the others. But we need a solution for retail banks, a solution for people, for families. We also need an option for communities and small businesses. We also need an option for raising a ton of money for really big pressing infrastructure needs. And those are different instruments. So we think that there's space for and a need for postal banking for individual people, public banks for communities and small businesses, so that, you know, for instance, the city of New York is not putting all its money in Wells Fargo and then it's being invested who knows where, you know, outside of the city, but that money comes back in the city and gets reinvested there. And a public investment bank is a great vehicle for things like funding the Green New Deal and infrastructure, which I know is top of mind for a lot of folks. So just to say that, you know, there are different, if there is an ecosystem of Wall Street, the way that things have been working, there needs to be an alternative ecosystem to replace it. Okay, so this was where we were, sort of swimming along, and the pandemic hit, Louis DeJoy hit. We have been working on postal banking for a long time with the fine folks at APWU and others, and then all of a sudden, you know, DeJoy's policies started to take effect, in the summer. And we realized that, Don's playbook about privatization was playing out real time. You can't have postal banking if there's no post office. And though he did not drop the P word, in his plans, it's certainly true that the Trump White House did in 2018 say that our end goal is privatization. So it was very much on the scene. So we worked with APWU and Public Citizen and some others, a lot of Take on Wall Street folks, the Grand Alliance, a lot of folks to convene a call in August, just to sort of make a plan, figure out what we were going to do. And I will confess, I did not do a lot of advertising of that call. And in about 24 hours, we had 475 RSVPs, and that's a lot of you who joined. A lot of folks, I think we had Jane Fonda lingering on the line. And in the end, we had ourselves a coalition with 300 organizations in it, pretty much overnight. The strength of, if Louis DeJoy has given us anything, it is the heightened awareness and the willingness of folks to fight. And so that has been great. We did a number of things as a coalition last year to respond to that moment. There was a petition drive to reverse the service cuts, and especially before the election, there was a real concern there, and we got over 2 million signatures all told. Between a Move On Organized Day of Action and an APWU Day of Action at the end of August, we had over 1,100 events at post offices around the country. And as a result, the House came out of recess for 12 hours on a Saturday in August to grill DeJoy and to pass an emergency relief bill. Even the Senate did its own hearing the Friday before, which was a bit more of a softball enterprise. But anyway, they felt the need to respond because they were getting thousands of calls from their constituents. So what does this have to do with postal banking? It feels like maybe it's a setback. But I think that one of the key arguments for folks in this coalition is that right now is actually the precise moment to go in the opposite direction. It's the precise moment to say, hey, now that America is watching, let us present a vision for what things could be, not what they are right now. And this, all of DeJoy's talk about, cutting the post office to health, and here's what we can't do, and if we, let's make the product worse, then let's charge more for it. All of that frame to just destroy, just blow up that frame. Like that is not where we want to be. We want to restore and expand the post office. We want it to be a hub for community services. We want postal banking to be central to that. But we want other things like rural broadband. We want senior checks. We want all of the proposals we heard about yesterday and that great paper that the IPS team put together. We don't have opportunities like this very often. And so, this is a moment for us. Okay, so what we've done so far, there were a lot of questions in the chat about the Board of Governors and about the new PMG and how to get rid of DeJoy. That has been front of mind for us for the last, certainly this year. We called on the White House and the Senate to fill those seats immediately. We heard from the transition team, back in the day that the reason there was even a transition team to talk about was because of our efforts over the summer, and that there was this weird spot where most transition teams then go into the agency that they are covering, and the fact that USPS management is still kind of hostile leadership was a real issue, and so the need to get the man some new bosses was front of mind. And then emergency relief legislation, Judy did an excellent job of framing that yesterday. So I'll just say we are echoing that ask, and we think it makes no sense for the airlines and the fast food joints and everybody getting bailed out, but not but there's no emergency relief to make USPS whole. It doesn't make any sense. And so we support further emergency relief that actually addresses the scale of the need. And then we thought, why not in this moment have the president lay out a vision for the post office as a hub for community services, as it has been in the past, and as it could be again in the future, and as I think in some of your communities probably has been the whole time. But why not lean into that? Why not expand services? Why not sort of make specifically use the fact that it's in every community as its comparative advantage, and provide services that people really need in communities that don't have access to these things. And then finally, in this speech or elsewhere, to name a postal czar. You know, as I think I mentioned, there needs to be, for something like postal banking, there needs to be a White House focal point, because if it is a partnership with Treasury, as Raúl mentioned, a partnership with the Federal Reserve, all of these things require, you know, an interagency, you know, someone to ride herd on the other folks in other agencies, and it's really hard to do that without having somebody have the president's ear and being, you know, in the White House staff. And so naming a focal point, and also, as I say, you know, DeJoy, you know, it's still there. So having somebody to be able to fill that vacuum in the meantime is going to be key. Just real quick, where we're going next. We were happy to see the names that that the administration put forward. We had organized another petition drive and gotten 460,000 signatures saying fill these seats now. And we were happy with the three first names. We consider it a down payment. There are another 2 seats coming up this year, so still working on those. We want to see Congress in particular get more ambitious. I think that there is a concern that that they might not be meeting the level of ambition that the moment requires, and that there needs to be a little bit of conversation about, you know, why do you really want to end up in this place again? I mean, it's really excellent and wonderful that you would be in a position to put forth a bill to repeal the pre-funding mandate. That's great. To do the Medicare fix, that is also great. But any weakening of service standards or any sort of leaving revenue streams not able to be capitalized on because, you know, there's legislation that says you can't enter that product space doesn't make any sense, because we'll be in that spot again in 3 to 5 years. And so to actually pass something in this moment that is a serious attempt to address the future of the post office. So we're working on that. One of the things we're working on is pairing postal banking with rural broadband, because rural broadband has also broad bipartisan support. And so thinking about ways that, you know, that bill has something in it for everyone. And then we really want to normalize more ambitious policy and make postal banking mainstream. I think that that has really taken off in the last year or so. You know, as Raúl mentioned, you know, folks have been working on this for a long time. And all of a sudden, the conversations I have with reporters now are, how would postal banking work? Not what's this crazy postal banking thing, and is that even real? You know, all the conversations are now about how, not about whether. So that's great, but I will say those are conversations with, you know, elite publications or lefty publications, and that we really need to break through to small town papers and to USA Today and to, you know, to folks further afield. And that's a good segue to more media coverage. We really need to make this both seem inevitable and seem mainstream and seem like something everyone's talking about, because that is one of the few things that moves Congress outside of donor money and self-interest. We really need to make sure that that we're expanding. We don't want to just be a club. We want to be a movement. And so making sure that folks know about postal banking, I think, is going to be really key. And so we're doing, you know, some polling about how to talk about it and talking to reporters. And one of the biggest projects that's emerging that is always difficult and that we're going to ask for your help on is how to collect stories so people can talk about what it's like to be unbanked or underbanked. And sometimes those are sensitive. You know, sometimes people don't want to share those stories, or they do, but they don't want their name attached to them. And that's fine. We completely understand. But I think that we will really be breaking through if we're able to collect a few stories and a few folks who are willing to tell their story or willing to be brave, much like Representative Presley did when she talked about when she first was a Hill staffer and she and she cashed her first check at the, I think it's an Ace Cash Express, I can't remember, but there's one check casher not too far from the Capitol, and she cashed her check there because she didn't know anybody who had a bank account. That's just what you did. And I really admire her bravery there, but we need more people telling their stories. Lots will tell them to me, but fewer will talk to reporters. So that's a question I have, and we will stick it in the chat. What we're trying to do is to just ask folks, and like, please send this out to your networks if you don't have any personal experience with paying too much at an ATM, using a check casher and having it cost a lot. Any of these things, to please share the survey across your networks. It's an ugly URL, so we'll put it in the chat so you can see it. But we're basically trying to collect these stories so that we can, basically tell the story of what problem it solves and raise awareness around what Rakim was saying about Black families losing $80,000 to these shysters over the course of their lives, that there's no reason why that has to be so, and there is a clear alternative. Also, we had a great, in my breakout group yesterday, I had a great conversation with one of the attendees who talked about remembering postal banking. And that is an amazing story too, as we wanna talk to our seniors who can tell us what it was like to have access to that. So I'm gonna stop, I've probably gone way over, but thank you, Chastity, and thanks Rakim and Raúl, and thanks all of you for being so engaged.
Thanks, Raúl, Rakim, and Porter. We really enjoyed your presentations. We have a few minutes for questions and answers from all of you. Reminder, if you have a question, it's best to identify yourself by hitting the raise your hand button at the bottom of your screen. If you can't find that, you can literally just raise your hand. We'll call on you, ask you to unmute yourself, and you can direct your questions to one of our speakers. The first question will come from Dennis O'Neill. Dennis, if you can unmute yourself for the question.
Hi, this is as much a report as a question, although I'll start it with the question. I work with a posse of retirees, mostly APWU, but the other unions, who started around the Stop Staples campaign and were successful in defeating the privatization attempt that represented. And we shifted a couple of years ago to working on postal banking in the Bronx and the effort to create a target zone. Conditions at that point in postal management were more favorable, no COVID, no DeJoy. And as with Staples, there are divisions in postal management, even upper postal management. Some people recoil in horror at the idea. Some people say, hey, maybe we could give it to Chase Bank or Amazon. And some people say, no, this is a way to save the post office. So, one of the things that you have to be aware of when you're working on this is that. And what we did was, with the aid and support of the national APWU and especially New York Metro, which was there, we went out to the Bronx and collected, I don't know what, I think we wound up with over 8,000 signatures on petitions for postal banking. And I want to encourage people, if there's a place in the process that we go, this is a really good thing to do. I live in Manhattan. I live in Harlem, which you think, oh, but in Manhattan, there are banks on every other corner. Prosperous neighborhoods, you get banks on 3 of the 4 corners, and then there's a CVS or a Rite Aid drugstore on the 4th. I mean, they're very common. So you think, why postal banking? You get up in the Bronx, it's a very different story. And you learn this by going out in front of post offices and talking to people. And people told us about their experiences, how far they had to go to get a check cashed or to get a reasonable bank branch. And it was generally extremely favorably received. In fact, of the petitions, we would tell people about postal banking. A few elderly types like myself actually had a postal bank account when they were little kids. Others who came from other countries. You know, Italians love postal banking, and apparently in Italy, the postal bank is the largest single banking institution in the country. So it's people from a number of places know that this is possible, is doable, is a positive thing. Other people, they like the idea once you explain it, and people were signing the petition and saying, okay, what do I do next? How do I get this? So there's genuine enthusiasm. We explained, you're not signing up for postal banking. We're, trying to fight for this. And we did some fairly successful work in the Bronx also with local politicians. One of our earlier signers was AOC, who was still at that point a candidate for office and had not yet been elected to the House, but who signed the petition, and we got somebody to take a picture of her doing it and promoted it. But even her, even the guy she ousted in the Democratic primary came out for this. All the local electeds came out, and we had an event where we were going to deliver with, a few dozen postal workers and some other supporters, our petitions to the postmaster of the Bronx, who vanished, not there, always at the office, nothing. So we went in, demanded that they take them anyway, and we got lots of nice photo opportunities of the empty parking space that said postmaster. All the other parking spaces were full. The postmaster had fled. So we were able to catch some media with this too. And that's an important factor. There are a bunch of other lessons I could talk about, but I just wanted to say that this, like the Staples thing, was a successful campaign, until things shifted. And I think that people should consider this if we can fit it into a strategy coming out of a Grand Alliance and other forces to fight for trial places first, rather than to demand it nationally.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in really quickly and ask if any of the panelists have any thoughts about the possibility of pilots or in New York or any other part of the country.
I mean, that organizing, Dennis, was amazing. And I know this happened in Cleveland as well. It was also really great and strong. And I know that every time we meet with a member of Congress's office, they ask, so interesting, this postal banking thing, but could the pilot be in my district? So very much noted, and it's certainly in the mix to think about, maybe not just 2 or 3, but like 5 or 10, so that it's a bit more representative and can actually speak to effectiveness.
Just my 2 cents on that. I think, as Porter said, the organizing is not only outstanding, it is vital, it is indispensable. And actually, interacting with people in places where financial services are needed and figuring out what they need from their point of view is just absolutely mission critical. What I will say, from having been a legal services attorney in New York City, serving clients in the Bronx when this idea first started rolling out, is that there are some details to work out with respect to state versus federal protections. And there was some concern, for instance, from consumer advocates who were afraid that the loans would not be as of high quality as we had wanted, because New York State's relatively strong consumer protection laws wouldn't apply in the federal context. So that's just something to keep an eye on. We're dealing with a geographically disparate banking system. So while I certainly advocate for postal banking across the board, there are some considerations we will need to take into account, as I think the on-the-ground experiences have suggested. And this is only to further say that we need to be doing the sort of, again, on-the-ground effort in order to get this right in terms of implementation.
Thanks so much, Raúl. Next, we'll have a question from Jim Kaufman. Jim Kaufman, if you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. It's more of a observation. I'm the legislative director for the Albany, New York local APWU. I'm retired from the Postal Service since 2014. I'm frustrated. I hear all these wonderful ideas, but from a lot of people who have never worked in the Postal Service, I have to tell you something. You got to picture the Postal Service as a living creature that's been wounded almost mortally. We're expecting this Postal Service, being wounded as it is, to jump up and start doing new tricks. There are two piles of money that belong to the Postal Service that people aren't pursuing. One pile comes from overpayment into the retirement system for workers who were pre-reorganization, that retired post-reorganization, and their retirement was hung on the Postal Service, not the Post Office Department. So there's money sitting in the government that should have gone to the Postal Service to cover the years that these people worked under the old system. The other pile of money was extorted from the Postal Service. I think we can all agree that this PAEA was a farce. It was never intended to pre-fund retiree health plan benefits. It was to offset the miserable deficit at the time. And that money belongs to the Postal Service, and it's not coming back. So we got legislation to say we don't have to pay anymore, but we should get that money back that was already paid. If we could get those funds back, we could repair the damage done and start off from a level playing field where we were doing the job we were supposed to do without any hindrance, and then start talking about all these wonderful additions to what we could do. I just really don't think it's going to succeed with the Postal Service as crippled as it is right now financially. So that's my 2 cents, and I really don't know why we're not pursuing these piles of money that belong to the Postal Service.
Amen.
Panelists, do you have anything to add here at all?
I will defer to Porter as far as strategic considerations go. I will just note that I agree that the general financing of arrangement of USPS should be revisited within the legislation before simply tacking on postal banking. And in fact, that was, one of the points I was trying to make, is that I don't think it will work well unless you revisit the deeper financing structure.
Yeah, agreed. And the other thing too is the more I dig into the history, the more that you guys know so well, that the more that Congress has made it impossible for USPS to make a profit and add new services. And even the parcel post was wildly controversial in the turn of the previous century. It's like, oh, it's outside the mandate. So every time there's like something really cool, like a pre-internet, one of you, I think, gave me this example. There was like a bill pay system set up in the early days of the internet that USPS was going to be able to do, and it was going to be very cool. And it got killed by the early internet companies. And so just to say, like, if we don't challenge the narrative that you're talking about, I think we will lose, because then maybe we'll get the letter but not the spirit of the law. And so I think saying look, it cannot be that it's not, USPS is not allowed to innovate or bring in new revenue just because any good idea should be, by default given to the private sector first. That isn't the way to run a public service. And so we need to out that so that we can, stop with these postal enhancements that are anything but.
All right, next we will go to Stephanie Appelin. Stephanie, if you can unmute yourself.
Hi, can you all hear me? Okay, I'll just ask my question. So my question is more targeted at Raúl. You mentioned the importance of privacy in tech and doing so through the idea of a wallet. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the difference between a wallet and a bank account. How would a wallet work? How is it more secure? And if postal banking were a thing, how would that be integrated?
Great, thank you so much. I think this is a really important question. As we dig down into, again, the details of implementation, I think there's a tendency to sort of conflate terms, but really you don't need any sort of legal background to think about this distinction, right? I have a wallet right here. I have a Bank of America card. Bank of America can see the finances related to this card. It can't see everything else that's going on in the wallet, right? If I use cash, that is a monetary instrument that does not report to a centralized ledger. It does not go to a bank. It does not go to the federal government. Although the federal government does keep track of, barcodes, et cetera, on cash, in order to prevent counterfeiting and money laundering, they do not keep a record of everybody's financial transactions at every given time. But that is the suggestion that some people are making for a new digital system. And to me, the question is not whether we go digital or not. We absolutely have to go digital. That's what we're doing. But the question is, are we going to maintain a space for anonymous or semi-anonymous transactions, or is everything going to be hoovered up by private data collection companies and eventually the US government? A few of the existing bills contain legal firewalls for financial privacy. Most important, I think, for this conversation is the Right to Financial Privacy Act of 1974, which prohibits certain agencies from sharing data. But the truth is that agencies are consistently sharing data unconstitutionally. This is especially true when we consider, again, immigration detention and law enforcement. And we want to preserve, I think, in a small c conservative way, the option for people to have financial transactions that do not just go, feed data into the machine. And I think legal sort of barriers, like saying you can't do this, is not really enough. It's in the technology, right? There's got to be e-cash that doesn't report to account, that is a bearer instrument that belongs to you, that is not a ledger instrument that belongs to the system. And so this sort of thing is, I think, again, if our focus is like racial equity, for instance, we absolutely have to put this front and center to a greater extent than we've been doing. And that's not because people are, ignorant of these concerns or lazy about it. It's just that we are now finally at the place where we're talking about handling out the details. So I think the distinction, again, which is apparent to everybody, on the street between a wallet and a bank account, needs to be preserved.
All right, thank you so much, Raúl. Due to the nature of time, that was our last question. Thank you very much to everyone for that discussion. A special thanks to our panelists for their presentations. Just like yesterday, we'll now be breaking out into smaller groups for some further discussion. As a reminder, in case you didn't join us yesterday, each of our breakout sessions will have a pre-assigned facilitator to lead you through the discussion. Please try to be respectful of everyone's time and desire to contribute to the conversation. We'll hope to gather some interesting insight and tackle some challenging problems as we build our people's postal agenda. We'll be back here in the main room in about 20 minutes. And really quickly, if you had questions that you wanted to ask but wasn't able to ask, feel free to drop it in the chat. Thank you again.